Good morning, everyone. We would like to get started. To be respectful of all of your time this morning. I'm Meg Disler. I'm the director of the St. Joe Community Health Foundation, and so delighted so many of you could be here today on really an important topic. We came at this topic because while we do these luncheons quarterly, we have a wonderful advisory board of people from a variety of agencies in this community who tell us what are things that they are hearing in the community that people are struggling with, or there's new laws, or there's changes, and some of the changes in the law we'll hear about, and then some of the discussion, what do you tell your clients when are they physically ready? So we've got some great experts, professionals here in the community who will really enlighten us. To start this, what we wanted to do is have everybody introduce themselves. And my colleague, Angela Stanley, is going to kind of start with a microphone wherever she is. And we just ask you to please introduce yourself, your title, and what group you're with in the community. If you have a quick announcement, you're welcome to do that. And I think we'll just start with that mic there. Okay. And it just is helpful so we all know who's in the room if you're trying to connect with somebody afterwards. And if you have a quick announcement, but this is really meant to be kind of speed dating, just so we know who's in the room.
So we're just going to kind of
and it helps our speakers also know who we have here as well. So.
Good morning. My name is Mindy Thiard, and I'm with New Mercies Ministries. And we provide hosting for children for parents in crisis. So that can look a lot of different ways. It could be medical, or it could be parents working through homelessness or different things like that. So we can offer a safe place and a family coach to kind of come alongside mom with their working those things out. So.
Hi, my name is Katie Rhodes. I'm the case manager for A Mother's Hope, and then I will pass to you.
Stacia Roth, Executive Director of A Mother's Hope. We're the only maternity home or housing specifically geared towards pregnant women who are experiencing homelessness in our community and the surrounding area.
Hello, my name is Constance Ruffin. I'm a local doula in Fort Wayne, and I'm currently contracted with Healthier Moms and Babies.
Hi, I'm Julie Von Gutten. I'm with Journey Beside Mothers. It's a ministry of associated churches, and we provide mentors and community for parenting and pregnant teens and moms of all ages in need.
Hi, I'm Jamie Wiedemann. I am a nurse home visitor for Healthier Moms and Babies.
Hi, I'm Shaquilla Robertson. I am a family advocate with Healthier Moms and Babies.
Hi, I'm Tyshelle Jackson. I'm a nurse home visitor with Healthier Moms and Babies.
There we go.
I'm Brittany Dance, and I am with Parkview Health, Family and Children, where we do safe sleep, breastfeeding, parenting, and nicotine-free baby and me.
I'm Marcy Baker. I am with Parkview, CHW Pediatric Specialty.
I'm Skylar Mont. I'm a nurse home visitor with Healthier Moms and Babies.
I'm Rochelle Hirschberger. I'm a family advocate with Healthier Moms and Babies.
My name is Esther Miela. I am with Healthier Mom and Babies. I am one of the family advocates. Thank you.
Good morning, Maria Martinez with Healthier Moms and Baby, family advocates.
Maria Diaz, Parkview Community Health Worker.
Jocelyn Tu, Community Health Worker at Parkview.
Hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm a Community Health Worker at Parkview as well.
Hi, I'm Janae Moore. I'm also a community health worker with Parkview.
Hi, I'm Lori Howard with Catholic Charities.
Laura Dwyer, Catholic Charities.
Hi, I'm Jackie Martinez, Programs Manager at Healthier Moms and Babies.
I'm Maria Charlin with Healthier Moms and Babies. I'm the Program Supervisor.
Lora Overton, practicing physician for 25 years, and I currently teach at Ivy Tech.
Justine Johnson, Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion with the Poor Handmaids of Jesus Christ Ministry.
Caroline Bradford. I work for Catholic Charities, and I'm a Community Services Case Manager.
Letitia Williams, Community Service Case Manager for Catholic Charities.
I'm Sydney Wilson. I am an MSW intern with Parkview Women's and Children's.
Hi, I'm Dominique Heineman. I'm a social worker with Parkview's OB Outreach Team.
Laura Pfluger, social worker with the Parkview Women and Children's Outreach Team.
Britte Nihart. I am the supervisor of the navigation team for Parkview and Allen County FIMR coordinator.
Good morning. I work at a Hope Center. I'm Director of Operations and Efficiency, nurse sonographer. My name's Pamela Anderson.
Hi, my name's Chelsea Nabosny. I'm at the University of St. Francis. I do the domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking prevention on the campus, but really I'm just here as a working mother.
I'm Jessica Butz, also with the University of St. Francis. I'm the Director of Foundation Relations.
Hi, I'm Megan Quigley. I'm the Assistant Director of the Assisi Program for Discipleship and Leadership at the University of St. Francis.
I'm Ann Kale, and I'm Director of the 3 Women's Care Centers in Fort Wayne.
I'm Ermina Mustadanagic, and I'm the CEO at Wellspring Interfaith Social Services.
Hi, I'm Liz Andrews, and I supervise the maternal and peer recovery coaches at Parkview.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. It always lifts me to know how many resources we have in the community working for working moms in the community when you all introduce yourselves. The first person I'd like to introduce you to, you've got the agenda there, is Britte Nihart. And Britte has worked as a woman and children's nurse navigator with Parkview since 2020. Currently, she's supervisor of that team, as well as taking on her newest role of the Allen County FIMR, and she can tell you a little more about FIMR, FIMR in just a moment, excuse me. And she has 25 years of experience in the nursing profession and has been at the realm of maternal and infant health care throughout it, with a deep passion in this area. She's also a certified nurse midwife. She has a passion for advocating for all patients in the healthcare system, especially pregnant and postpartum women and their families. So please give us an update on FIMR.
Okay, I don't know, does this microphone carry well enough? Okay. The FIMR program in Indiana, that stands for Fetal and Infant Mortality Review. That is something that Allen County has had for a number of years, and Erin Norton used to do that role, and so I've taken over for her just in the last few months. So it's pretty new to me, but I'm really enjoying it. And starting in October, we're going to be expanding. We have bringing on a couple more people to our team for that purpose, and we're going to expand and cover, do those reviews for the 11 county Northeast Indiana region. So the other counties hadn't been having those cases reviewed, so we're going to start taking that on. So looking forward to that because I think it'll bring even more information and awareness to what the problems are. I'm really pleased that we're having the experts here today to talk about this, the topic of specifically maternal family medical leaves and how that affects women during pregnancy, because as most of us know, stress in pregnancy is a significant risk factor for leading to prematurity, preterm birth, low birth weight, anything that causes excessive stress. If you're having a lot of stress from your employer or stress because you're afraid you're going to lose your job, that's going to have an impact. And when I first was asked to, bring some information about this from our FIMR group especially, I just put out a message to the other navigation team members and the FIMR group members and said, any specific cases you know of women that have had these issues, can you just shoot them out to me? And I immediately got, well, 5, like within 20 minutes. So it is something that we see a lot of. And I'm going to give you a few of those examples here. Obviously, no names, all de-identified, but we had a patient that had a complicated pregnancy, which required more medical appointments than typical. Her boss was giving her points for missed work, even if she had a doctor's note, so she knew she was being penalized for going to the doctor. Her boss was calling her daily when she was on bed rest and asking her when she could come in. She asked her boss for accommodations such as, less lifting. She was working in a role where she was cleaning and she had to lift heavy, full garbage bags out of trash cans, lift them high to get them out. And so she just asked if she could have someone else help her do that. And that was denied. And she was ultimately threatened that she was going to be fired if she missed any more work. She had other children to provide for, so she went through a lot of stress during that time. We had another one that works in a local factory. She felt like they gave her a lot of trouble with even signing up for their insurance plan, health insurance plan. Like she was getting the runaround from her HR department. It made her feel like they were trying to weed her out and maybe even trying to force her to quit because she was pregnant and was going to cost them money on their insurance plan. She had to come to the maternal fetal medicine specialist office regularly because of complications, and they gave her a lot of trouble also about getting off work for appointments. So therefore, she decided instead of going to the specialist and her OB like she was supposed to, she just went to the specialist and she was skipping her OB appointments, which can be very dangerous, but she felt like she had no choice. We had another patient who was herself a pharmacist, and she went to the emergency room during her pregnancy for a problem and had to work. She was in the ER all night and she had to work the next morning early. She called them to say, she had been in the ER all night and was having some problems, and they said, "We don't have anybody to cover you, you have to come in." So she did. She requested a doctor's note to work some shorter shifts after she had received a concussion during her pregnancy, and they declined that also. So it's not just, this covers women with all types of jobs, all types of work, every education level. We had another one who worked at a local food establishment. Her manager asked her if she was going to take off the whole 6 weeks after her baby was born because they didn't really think she should. She was having signs of preterm labor for several days, but she had to work every day, and she called her manager to say she wasn't sure if she was in labor, and the manager said she had to come in because they didn't have anybody else, so she did. And she was in preterm labor for a couple of days and worked, and then ended up in the hospital after that. And then the last case, we had a patient who had a twin pregnancy. She lost one twin early on and continued the pregnancy. The second twin was surviving. That baby ended up being delivered by C-section at 26 weeks and was in the NICU. So all around a stressful, emotional, draining time. She went back to work 2 weeks postpartum, post C-section, while baby was in the NICU because she wanted to be able to have some time off when he came home from the NICU. And she knew she wouldn't have any if she spent it while he was, sitting at his bedside in the NICU. So, and she also felt a little bit of judgment from the NICU staff because her husband was able to be there with the baby, but she wasn't there much because she was at work. So she felt like they were a little chilly to her because of that. So these are just like I said, off the top of our heads, some cases, but it's definitely a problem, and it's definitely something we need to figure out a way to support women better with.
Thank you, Britt. You've actually really helped us realize this is happening every day around us, and I know many of you as case managers have your own clients, but then the question is, what does the law enable us to do? I mean, what are your rights? What is going on with the legislation? And I am very delighted that we have two local attorneys who are going to here to help us answer questions and understand what does the law provide with this. So I didn't let them introduce themselves before so that I get the chance to introduce them. First, we have Rachel Steinhofer. She is a partner with Barrett McNagny and represents clients in the employment arena with a great deal of expertise in Title VII, the American Disability Act, ADA, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, Indiana Wage Payment Statute, and the Indiana Wage Claim Statute, and the Indiana Workers' Compensation Act, and many other acts that make my head spin, and I'm grateful for her expertise to help guide people in our community, employers as well as individuals, on what are the rights and how that works. Along with her is another attorney, Carta Robison, and Carta's also an attorney with Barrett McNagny. She focuses her practice also in the area of labor and employment. She works with employers to help prevent and solve disputes with employment contracts and claims involving Title VII, the ADA, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, Indiana Wage Payment Statute, Indiana Wage Claim Statute, Indiana Workers' Compensation Act. You can see the expertise that these ladies have, and we're so fortunate to have them not only in our community but with us now to help discuss what are the rights of these moms? What are the rights of the employers? What does the law say in Indiana? Thank you. Thank you, Meg.
I like to walk when I talk, guys, so.
Click it on.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Oh, there we go. Okay. So Carta and I went about this a little bit differently. Normally when we do these presentations, we have a lot of PowerPoint slides. But for me in particular, I'm very passionate about prenatal and pregnant women's rights, even though typically I am on the employer side of things in my practice, okay? But I also speak from experience. I'm a working mom. I've got two littles, they're 7 and 5. My 7-year-old, my pregnancy was perfectly fine, telltale labor, delivered him at 38 weeks. Everything was fine. My second pregnancy, not so much. I had a lot of preterm labor with her. I was high risk anyway because they found an abnormality with her at 20 weeks. She's perfectly fine. So I did have my regular OB appointments. I had my maternal fetal medicine appointments. And then at 35 weeks, I went into preterm labor. Luckily, my labor actually stopped when I was in triage, but I was discharged on bed rest to make it to 37 weeks. And then that's when my FMLA started, because I work for a firm that is an FMLA employer under the definition. So I come from this not only from a legal perspective, but from a lived experience, right? And I'm very fortunate that I've worked at a firm that has always accommodated what I have needed, but I also work at a job that is desk-oriented. And so when I needed to work from home, when I was uncomfortable in the office, they let me do that, okay? Now, Meg, I love this though. We have a brand new law that very specifically addresses pregnancy and childbirth-related conditions. It's called the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. It became effective on June 27th of this year. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and it basically mirrors the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Our whole life is basically acronyms, okay? For those of you who are counseling your clients and your patients about what their rights are in the employment arena, I think it's important for them to know that the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act now requires employers to provide reasonable accommodation, I know these are legal words, for individuals for pregnancy and childbirth related conditions. So, Britte, a lot of your examples that you were talking about, lifting, That would be an easy thing to accommodate. Having a coworker help you lift something that's heavy. Taking more frequent bathroom breaks. Taking more breaks to eat because you are growing a child, right? Those are all
having water
at your stations. For those who are on factory lines, the ability to sit or stand more frequently because we are uncomfortable as our bodies change. Those are low-hanging fruit accommodations that the Department of Labor has already said, you, the employer, if you are an employer under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, you should be providing to your employees, okay? A lot of employers then have the question of, well, what's a childbirth-related condition? Well, very much, you know, in my personal example, I went into preterm labor. They started my FMLA early. Now, I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but the employer has to do the bare minimum of what is required by law. They can do more, but it depends on the employer, okay? But really wanting you guys to understand that while an individual is pregnant, that they have rights under the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, that they should be accommodated if it's a reasonable accommodation. And there's always the balance of what the employer has to do. And in our legal world, it's called an undue hardship, as long as the accommodation is not an undue hardship to the employer. And I know I'm talking about a lot of legal stuff. But basically, if the employer can't do it, then there's going to have to be some other discussion of what can happen. But time off without penalty to go to appointments, not being disciplined under the attendance policy to go to your appointments because you are pregnant, that should be an accommodation, in my opinion. So it's a new law, and there are a lot of things we don't know about because we don't know how it's going to apply. What I will tell you is, for your clients, your patients, if they work at a place where, and most employers are also ADA employers because it's also 15 or more employees, if they are following the ADA, they should be following the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act because they essentially mirror each other. In our world, the significance of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act is the first time that our federal government is recognizing that what I call a temporary condition, pregnancy, can be a disability, because the ADA really only addresses permanent conditions. Okay, so that's the significance of that. It opens up the door for a lot of things later on. So I'm excited to see how the case law, when employees and employers challenge each other on this and they end up going to court, how judges make the law based on this. I suspect there will be amendments because there are so many questions that we, even as lawyers, have about how we apply this new law, okay? So knowing that pregnancy and childbirth-related conditions should be accommodated. That's number one. That's a right that we have. That's before leave. Now let's talk about leave itself, okay? Second step. Most commonly, workers or employees are provided leave under the Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA. Here's the thing, though. Not every employer is an employer under the FMLA. The FMLA applies to those employers who have 50 or more employees. Smaller businesses, under that amount, they are not required to provide FMLA to their employees. And the significance of the FMLA is that it is the only federal law that requires an employer to provide job-protected leave. Job-protected. All other type of leaves that we are talking about are not job-protected. Even if an employer provides it, you are not guaranteed your job when you come back from leave if it's not FMLA leave. So that's a very important distinction, okay? Now, it's also unpaid. A lot of employers say that their employees have to, and this is the verbiage from the handbooks because I do the policies, they say that any FMLA leave or any other leave of absence has to run concurrently at the same time as any paid time off or vacation or whatever paid time off that the employer provides, which means that typically an individual who is on leave after childbirth, their FMLA will be paid through paid time off benefits, but when they get back, they have no paid time off available to use, okay? And I will admit, employers do that on purpose because employees use all 12 weeks. They're entitled to that. They should, not saying anything against that, but they are trying to minimize the use of other time off for those individuals after they return to work. I'm just being very transparent with you guys. okay? But that's not the only leave that's necessarily available. For those employees or employers that are not employers under the FMLA, some still provide leave. They'll typically have it in their handbooks. So your clients, your patients who are employed by smaller employers, they need to visit their handbook policies. And the employer policies will outline, hopefully, some other type of leave of absence, whether it's a medical leave of absence or general personal leave of absence. I have a lot of clients who aren't employers under the FMLA who provide FMLA-like leave of their own version. And it basically is job-protected leave that they provide. Because this is the thing about the law, as I've said already. An employer has to provide what is required by the law, the minimum. They can always provide more, but they don't have to. So it is whether the employer chooses to provide more, okay? And of course, when an employer provides more, there's always going to be a cost. And so they're balancing how to run a business with providing benefits to employees. That's typically what it comes down to. But to be aware of what is available under any law for leave, as well as any handbook policy for leave. There may be actually a policy in there that says, if you are not eligible for FMLA leave because they are an FMLA employee, you may request a leave of absence under this policy. In my world, that means that covers either an individual who has not been employed with the employer for 12 months and worked 1,250 hours, that's eligibility requirements for the employee to have FMLA, or on the flip side, they've exhausted their 12 weeks of FMLA and need an extended leave. And so they can go to their employer and say, I need to extend my leave under the personal leave of absence policy. Now I suspect in most cases there's language in that policy that says the employer reserves the right to exercise their discretion about whether they approve that leave. But the point is, you can ask for it, right? So to be aware and to educate our clients and our patients about what they can ask for, should look for, on that side of preparing for leave as well, especially under the FMLA, what are the notice requirements for the employee? When do they have to give notice to their employer that they're going to need leave? And sometimes the policies themselves in their handbooks address that as well. What I'll tell you very generally is that the FMLA, especially in terms of pregnancy, you should probably give notice as soon as you can. I know, for example, with my first, I waited and waited because I wasn't showing and I didn't know, I was afraid of miscarriage. So I didn't tell my firm until almost 20, that was probably 17 or 18 weeks when I announced that I was pregnant. With my first, I was showing too soon, or my second, I was showing too soon. I was probably 10 or 11 weeks. I'm like, I'm pregnant. I'm like, okay. So it is based on, necessity. Oh, on that point, and I didn't talk about this, and I know I'm way running over.
That's okay.
The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act I won't say may, I believe, from a legal perspective, requires employers to provide accommodation in the event that an employee has a miscarriage. And the medical treatment that is required possibly after that. That is a childbirth-related condition. That is a pregnancy condition, in my opinion. Okay? That was a tangent, okay? And then the last thing I want to remark about preparing for leave is that when you are preparing for leave, whether it's under a handbook policy or whether it's under the FMLA, the employee needs to ask the employer, the HR department, hey, am I going to be responsible for my insurance premiums? How are those paid, right? A lot of people forget about that. Also, what are my short-term disability benefits to the extent that they have them or they are offered, okay? A lot of those they're on the side because under the FMLA, an employer has to maintain all the benefits that were intact before the leave. They don't have to pay for them. So what typically happens is that an employer will approve FMLA leave, and I'm very strictly talking about FMLA leave, and they will say to the employee, you are still responsible for your insurance premiums while you are on leave. Well, if that leave is unpaid, they're not deducting it from their paycheck. So either the employee has to reimburse the employer while they're on leave, pay directly to the carrier, whatever it is the arrangement is that the employer has. But that's like a fine print, if you will, detail that a lot of people forget about. And then the last thing that I'll leave you guys with is that obviously then there's the birth or the placement or the adoption, because I want to be all inclusive of the child. And so then the employee needs to notify the employer of the event occurring. So, because that's typically what triggers the leave starting, unless something else happens. Okay? And we're talking about this very chronologically. So I'm going to hand it over to Carta to talk about what happens to when returning to leave. Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll use this
Okay.
one. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carta Robison. As mentioned, I work very closely with Rachel at Barrett McNagny. I'm an associate attorney, so I'm still fairly early in my practice, but Rachel is my mentor, and as you can see, I learn so much from her every day. So we've tried to give you a chronology of just generally preparing for leave, pregnancy, preparing for leave, and I'm just going to talk briefly about what we think your clients and patients should consider when they are preparing to return back to work from leave. So as Rachel mentioned, if they have a policy in place that governs FMLA or something like FMLA, then their job should be secured for them and they should be ready to return to work. That's not the case for all employers, and again, as Rachel mentioned, certainly not the case if the employer has less than 50 employees. But in the world of the law, there are lots of new laws governing pregnant employees. And so one of the newest ones is called the PUMP Act, which you may have heard of before. And that was enacted last year in 2022. And the PUMP Act stands for Providing Urgent Maternal Protections for Nursing Mothers. Material protections, I think it is. Is it maternal?
I think it was maternal, but I don't.
We're going with maternal.
I only know the acronyms.
It's just, yeah, that's why I was thinking I should tell them what it means, but it's the PUMP Act. So the first thing that employees should do, certainly, is inform their employers of when they are coming back to work. And as Rachel mentioned at the end, a lot of this depends on when the occurrence, birth, placement, adoption of the child occurs, because that triggers the clock for the 12 weeks, the 6 weeks, whatever it is. So the specific date of the adoption or birth is very important and then triggers the return to work. The biggest question that a lot of employees will often have is, well, I've had this child and I want to breastfeed this child. How do I do that at the office or at my location where I work? How will pumping, breastfeeding be accommodated? The PUMP Act is very important because it now signals to employers that they are responsible for creating a private space free from intrusion that is not a bathroom, that also preferably has a hand washing station for hand washing, cleaning of pump parts, is also preferably next to an electrical outlet for mothers who can use an electric pump. Those are the preferreds, but the main point is employers now are responsible for offering that secluded space that's not a bathroom. So it's very important, again, that your clients and your patients fully understand that they have this ability in the workplace, and it's for 12 months. I think it's important, too, that when you return to work, and I too am a working mom, and I'm fortunate, as Rachel mentioned, that we are given a lot of support in the workspace as working mothers. But it does come down to your clients and patients being advocates for themselves. But I fully acknowledge, and I think Rachel would agree, that being an advocate means you have to have the knowledge base and understand what's out there and available to you and what you can push back on with your employer. One of those things that I mentioned is just the functionality of the space. If they're giving you some dark closet in the middle of the space where people are going and coming, or there's just some partition there, I mean, really have the ability to stand 10 toes down and say, this is not going to work for this space, for what I need to do as a nursing mother. They have to also be able to take those breaks that they need as often as possible without fear of retaliation from the employer. That's extremely important. The employer is not going to be able to say, you only get 2 breaks, you only get 3 breaks, whatever it is, or whatever arbitrary number that the employer comes up with. It is a reasonable amount of time as often as the employee needs to pump and express milk. They have to also be able to provide a cool space for that milk to be stored as well. And it could be the availability of a cooler of some type. Doesn't necessarily have to be a refrigerator, that's preferable, but the employer should be able to support the need for personal storage of that milk for the remainder of the employee's time at work. I think I talked about shielded from view, right? Free of intrusion. Yes. Yes.
That's the big one.
Yes, the pay during lactation breaks. This is going to be a big concern, probably one that employers are going to push back on. Pay is not supposed to be impacted by the employee.
Oh, well, no. So
Is
under
it-
the Fair Labor Standards Act, they can be unpaid.
Oh, under Fair Labor Standard. I apologize.
No,
So under
it's okay.
Fair
I
Labor
know.
Standards Act, the pay that the employee, the pay is, it's unpaid for the period of time that the employee takes these lactation breaks. So if they, go ahead, Rachel.
I'm sorry, guys.
No,
I'm
no.
sorry. Okay, this is a little complicated, and I get a lot of calls on this. So it's silly. We've got the Pump Act, but actually where the lactation breaks were first addressed was under the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, because they were addressing it from a wages standpoint. What the Fair Labor Standards Act says is that an employer has to provide reasonable unpaid breaks to express milk, okay? Now, caveat to that. Let's say your handbook says you're going to have 2 paid 10-minute breaks and a 1-hour unpaid lunch break. For the if your employee chooses to use the 2 paid 10-minute breaks to pump, they will be paid for the 10 minutes, but any time over that will be unpaid. And if they choose to pump during their unpaid lunch break, then it will be unpaid.
So as much time as they need, it depends on the policies, the wages, the paid time, the paid breaks, the unpaid breaks. So as much time as they need is available to them under the Pump Act.
Yep.
But again, we recognize that means some employees may have to just give consideration to the amount of time they feel that they need over the course of their workday.
Basically, these two laws, if you're reading them together, allow for the employer to balance the expense of employing this individual, because I think we would all agree that we don't get paid to do nothing. And I think that is the logic behind saying, and I'm not saying pumping is nothing. We both
No, it is not.
we both nursed, we both pumped, but the logic is if they have been relieved from all their work duties while they are pumping, then they should not be paid. There are some caveats when individuals like the two of us are salaried. Sometimes I pumped at I pumped in my office because I had a locked door, and I also had a refrigerator in my office. Again, different setting than factory, manufacturing, a lot of other settings that our clients and patients are dealing with. But I would typically type or dictate while I pumped and multitask.
So we just wanted to bring your awareness to this second newer law that's been implemented by the federal government, and that it should be, employers should be having this discussion and providing information and or updating their handbooks, whatever it may be. Part of that conversation could be when the employee gives notice about the need for leave or announces their pregnancy, however that occurs as well. So it's just very important to be aware that these laws exist. It's I think from a working mother's perspective, a very nice trend in the right direction for the view of working mothers in the workplace and the support that the law is starting to give in that regard. But ultimately, I think it's just important to recognize there's a prohibition on retaliation. So it's important that your clients and patients understand that they have the ability to exercise this right under the law and be free of retaliation in that regard too. One of the things that Rachel and I also counsel our clients about is the employee doesn't necessarily have to, they can request that space in advance for pumping. It's nice for the employer to request that the employee ask when they're, for example, they're notifying the employer that they're coming back to work on October 1. I plan to pump at work. May I please have a space available for me? The employer cannot require that notice, right, Rachel? Right. They cannot require that the employee request that. But as a courtesy to ensure that they're ready to go on day one, if that closet or whatever needs to be rehabbed in some way to make it available and functional for that employee, it might be nice for the employer to have some notice. But that's the caveat. It would just be a nice courtesy, so to speak.
It's typically addressed in employer handbook policies about, hey, we'd appreciate if you plan to pump, please give us advance notice so that we can make accommodation or make arrangements so that everything is ready for you when you come back.
That's all I have with respect to the return to work aspect. Did you have anything else, Rachel?
Well, I have a lot.
There's a lot. Well, Rachel will stick around for questions and answers, which I think comes later, right, Meg? I have to run, but my contact information as well as Rachel's is on the agenda. Should you have additional questions, we can take them too.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I've learned a lot, and I thank you for sharing your personal stories as well. Now the other question is more about what is the mother's physical condition? When can she safely go back? That's been referenced by Britte, by Rachel, by Carta, and I'm delighted we have Dr. Lora Overton. Dr. Lora was a practicing OB/GYN until 2019, and then she progressed into full-time teaching at Ivy Tech Community College. Dr. Overton has a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology and a medical degree from the Oklahoma College of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery. She did a family practice residency and an OB/GYN residency at the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. She's also been an adjunct faculty member of Indiana Wesleyan University, a guest lecturer at St. Francis, and the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. She holds a Master of Arts and magna cum laude in theology from Life Christian University in Tampa, Florida. She's very active in her church and in our community. Her church, Come As You Are. And I'm really pleased to say that she's also a board member of the St. Joe Community Health Foundation, guiding us on programs like this. So, Dr. Lora.
Well, thank you. I do have some PowerPoints. Do I control them here? Okay. All right, just a few PowerPoints, not many, but I do want to touch on what the previous speakers have already talked about. First of all, stress. I want to talk just a little bit about what stress does to the female body, especially during pregnancy. And I also want to hit on this topic of reasonable childbirth-related conditions. What do those look like? Now, you guys know, because a lot of you have children. I've only delivered them. I've not had any, so I can tell you just a few things. So let's just talk about how pregnancy affects the mother. So hormones, let's talk about hormones first of all. Estrogen. We know that estrogen affects the urinary tract, and so when she talked about reasonable bathroom accommodations, okay, so what happens is that the increase in estrogen, in order to maintain that pregnancy, you urinate a lot, right? Okay, that's just a hormonal effect. Heart and blood vessels. Your heart and blood vessels expand, of course, because the water level in your body expands. Your bones, your breasts, your hair, your mucous membranes, you're always congested for those pregnant women. So some of that, I had a lot of students this morning that were congested. They were constantly getting up and leaving the room because they didn't want to blow their nose in front of the whole classroom. Okay, and then brain. Everybody's heard of baby brain, right? Those moods, the foggy thinking, all of those things that everybody gets mad at you about because you just can't pay attention, right? Progesterone helps to improve mood, so hopefully you don't have a progesterone deficiency. It supports the thyroid, supports lactation. When we talk about breastfeeding, it supports the placenta. Without progesterone, the placenta can't function. The baby will spontaneously abort, right? And it helps to prevent preterm labor. And again, stress, we're going to hit on that also. So, estrogen, the average level in a non-pregnant female is about 30 to 400 picograms per milliliter. Okay, just think 30 to 400. But in a pregnant woman, as high as 20,000. So just think of all those complications or those effects of estrogen and multiply it 1,000 times in a pregnant woman. Progesterone, average levels in a non-pregnant female can be anywhere up to 25 nanograms per milliliter. In first, second, and third trimester, we see how much it's accelerated. So all of those things that our hormones do to us and make us feel are just amplified in pregnancy. Okay, just think of PMS. How do you feel with PMS? Now think about what a pregnant woman feels like all month long for 9 months versus just 2 or 3 days out of the month, okay? All right, so in the first trimester, the reproductive organs, and again, this is talking about childbirth-related conditions. So what does her body feel like the first trimester? Reproductive organs become increasingly vascular and engorged with blood, so you feel bloated all the time. Uterus enlarges to the size of a grapefruit or a melon. So just think about where the uterus sits. The uterus sits in the pelvic cavity, sitting on top of the bladder and against the intestines. So if you have any intestinal complaints like irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, Crohn's disease, all of those things, pregnancy-related condition can amplify those things, okay? Uterus pushes on the bowel and bladder, nausea and vomiting are of course common. So in that first trimester of pregnancy, when you have that quote unquote morning sickness that can occur all day long, you may need to leave your factory line in order to go throw up, or to go to the bathroom, or to blow your nose. And who understands that except for another woman who's been carrying a baby, okay? Second trimester, it just gets worse. Uterus grows about to the size of a melon or a watermelon. It causes more increased pressure on the bowel and the bladder, can cause even more constipation because right about now your doctor's increasing not only your prenatal vitamin, but he's adding some iron to that, right? Or she is adding some iron to that. Increases of the hormone human placental lactogen. Yeah, huge word, but just increase of another hormone, okay? This hormone spares maternal glucose for the fetus. You get less glucose, it reduces insulin sensitivity. Consequently to that, diabetes may occur in the mother. So if a mother's got gestational diabetes, it's going to happen right about here. About 3 to 10% of women, probably more so now since these statistics came out, will develop type 2 diabetes in the future. Probably about 10 to 20% because we're seeing more and more diabetes in the community. Okay, so this occurs in the second trimester. So now not only is she seeing her doctor because of, pregnancy-related conditions every 2 weeks, she may be seeing an endocrinologist now, right? Another doctor's appointment. In the third trimester, uterus about the size of a watermelon, and that pressure is constant on the bowel and the bladder. Also presses on the diaphragm, causing more shortness of breath and more nasal congestion. Size of the uterus causes, that pregnant woman, that walk, that lordosis, that changes the structure of your whole body. So you may fall more, and those women who have to lift heavy things, right? Lifting the trash out of a trash can. Or in my case, I had a situation where one of my patients worked on a factory assembly line where they had to lift tires. Can't do that, right? Can't do that, okay? Curvature of the spine changes the center of gravity of the mother. Again, more cases of falling. What other pregnancy-related conditions can we think about there? Back pain, constant back pain, swollen legs, right? Edema in the legs. You have to sit with your feet up, right? You can't stand for 2-3 hours. You can't stand in a factory line for 8 hours. You just simply cannot, okay? You cannot do that. Again, pregnancy-related conditions. So I like the definition pregnancy-related conditions, but what does that mean? That can mean any of those things, Okay, physiological changes. Let's talk about gastrointestinal system, nausea, vomiting, heartburn. Remember that huge old watermelon is pressing up against your diaphragm, causing the stomach acid to regurgitate up into your esophagus, making you belch all the time. Constipation is common. Urinary system, we need to remember not only is that baby pressing on the mom's bladder, but because of the fetus, how does the fetus urinate? How does the fetus get rid of waste? Well, the fetus gets rid of waste through the mother. So not only is the mother getting rid of her own waste, the mother is getting rid of the fetal waste also. So you've got increased urination because of that, okay? Respiratory system, because of increased estrogen, the mother becomes edematous, congested, nasal stuffiness. The mother will have more shortness of breath because the diaphragm is pushing up against the uterus. Cardiovascular system, remember, total body water and blood volume increases can be up to much as 40% because the mother has to guard herself against blood loss after she delivers. So there's an increased amount of water in the mom. So again, you've got shortness of breath, you've got edema in the nose, you've got swollen ankles and legs, okay? All to accommodate the needs of the pregnancy. Blood pressure may rise at the end of pregnancy, causing our cardiac output to increase. Now, we talked about stress. What does stress look like? Now, we know things can stress us, like for instance, food insecurity, that's a biggie. Childcare issues, that's another biggie. Improper or unsafe housing, that's a biggie. What if you have other children that you're not sure about whether or not they're safe at home if you have to go into preterm labor and go to the hospital? That's a biggie. All of these things and more cause stress on the pregnant woman. So what does stress do to the pregnant female? All of us have heard of fight or flight or flee, right? I'm not going to talk about the or freeze part, fight or flight. That's what I want to hit on. So what happens when you're stressed and you kick into fight or flight? Catecholamines, those wonderful things called epinephrine and norepinephrine, increase in the body from the adrenal cortex. And what do those things have? What do those things do to us? They cause us to fight, increase glucose, okay, or flee. Glucose goes to the muscles so that you can run from the bear in the woods, right? Well, if you increase your glucose amount to your muscles, okay, but you're sitting on a couch, not running from a bear in the woods, what happens to all that glucose? Increases your risk of gestational diabetes, does it not? What happens when you increase all your heart rate? Because epinephrine increases your heart rate, right? So that you can run from a bear in the woods. Your heart pumps blood to your lungs so that you can breathe in and run away from the bear in the woods. So what happens when your heart rate speeds up? Increases your blood pressure. So when we have stress in pregnancy, we see an increase in high blood pressure, hypertension, and an increase in gestational diabetes that may result in hypertension and diabetes later on, which decreases our life expectancies. All of those can be pregnancy-related conditions, okay? All right, so recovery. Estrogen, it takes about 3 to 6 months for your estrogen levels to return to normal. So all those moods, hormone surges, all that increased vasculature, all that swelling and edema, all of that stuff, it may take 6 months before you're back. Let's not even talk about breastfeeding and the need for, the estrogen, progesterone for breastfeeding and pumping, okay? By the way, pumping, again, not had a baby, but those of you who have pumped, can you pump in 10 minutes? So now not only can you not pump in 10 minutes, okay, I've watched women pump, so I knew that was a tricky question. Okay, not only can you not pump in 10 minutes, but now you're stressed because you're taking time off from work in which you're being paid $7.50 an hour, and you're losing that amount of money, and you can't feed the kids at home because you got to pump for the baby. Stress again, which also goes to increasing your high blood pressure and increasing your diabetes. The uterus itself only takes about 6 to 8 weeks to go back to normal so that there's less pressure on the bowel and the bladder. But again, if you lost a lot of blood in pregnancy, you're still on the iron and the prenatal vitamin and you're still constipated and you still have all these issues that you have to deal with and go back to work and make a living. So that's just a 10-minute discussion about what we studied for a year, right, in college and medical school and in nursing school. So that's just a summary of what happens with pregnancy. And I think we'll have questions later on, right? Okay.
I have to say, as you went through all of that and the impact, not only do I understand that the physical condition is very real, but I'm really glad I already had my children because that scared me on some of the conversation. Ignorance is sometimes blissful. Are there any questions we have for the speakers that we want to do? And then I'm going to...
Hi. So I'm from Catholic Charities, and we just implemented last year a new parent leave. And original leave was 2 for the father and 4, which was not what we proposed, but anyway, 4 for the mother. And then we were told if you do new parent leave, it has to be the equal amounts for each. And I'm just curious if that's a federal law, Indiana law, anyone know?
Okay. The reason why, typically from a legal perspective, employers are advised to make sure that parental leave is the same amount or length of time to be exercised, to be requested, not necessarily used, is because we can get what we refer to, but it's not really even referred to this anymore, is reverse discrimination. You cannot treat, in a traditional male and female biological type of setting, you cannot treat males differently than you can females, which I know is silly because the females are the ones doing all the work. I'm just going to say that, okay? But when my clients, employers, ask me to prepare a parental leave policy, whether it's in addition to FMLA or just because, it is any employee who meets these triggering events will be eligible to take, let's just say, 6 weeks off of unpaid leave. It does not matter if the individual is male, female, or any other LGBTQ type of identity. That is the parent, and they are requesting leave for the birth of a child. Yep.
So this is paid, but if we made it just maternity leave and didn't offer, would we get around it, which is not going to go over well, but I'm just asking. I'm trying to get more for the mother.
I will tell you, though, from an employer standpoint, the employer is really taking the risk on to say, well, I'm only offering leave to the female employees. I'm giving a benefit to one sex and not the other. Because here's the thing. I know we get up here and we talk and we have all different types of genders or identities and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. We're all part of protected classes. Male is a sex. Female is a sex. Transgender is a sex. And so if we are only going to isolate females, then we are treating everybody else less favorably from an employer standpoint. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying from a legal perspective, that is how I would come down on the issue.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
If a new mom has a stillbirth, is she still able to take the full 12 weeks of FMLA?
Okay, so I can talk it out, it's fine. It's fine.
It helps us for the recording.
Oh, for the recording, sorry. Okay, so in the event of a stillbirth, the individual's own health condition will still trigger the need for FMLA leave. It's triggered twice, by the birth of a child still, even though the child did not survive, and then by the condition of the individual herself because she has to recover. I still believe, and I'm not a medical expert, but if you've delivered a child, typically you're not released from work. In the FMLA setting, employers generally require their employees to provide a return to work certification signed by their doctor. And so when I had traditional vaginal births, and so that was not until 6 weeks. Now, I still was entitled to additional 6 weeks of leave, but 6 weeks was for myself to recover, and 6 weeks was to bond for the child. That's really how we break it down. So once she's released, so let me be clear. Once she's released to return to work for her own physical condition, she can be returned to work for whatever number of weeks that is that her doctor thinks that she is ready to go back. caveat to that. When something like that happens, there are a lot of emotional and psychological after effects. That also qualifies for FMLA, potentially an accommodation under the ADA, because the ADA protects those who need an accommodation for a physical or mental disability. And so leave under the FMLA for the additional 6 weeks, let's just say 6 weeks for healing physically and then 6 weeks for mental, could be a scenario under that.
Say it into the microphone if you would, please.
For these patients, like I talked about earlier, that maybe they're coming to us, they're pregnant, they're stressed, they're getting a hard time from their employer. They don't want to let them come to medical appointments, and they want to, they're kind of threatening them or veiled threats. How can we support them, and what should we tell them to do?
Those are really great questions because there's not one answer, right? I say this to a lot of people in the employment arena. Unfortunately, we live in a world of gray. And oftentimes, my response is, it depends. It depends on the employer size, the laws that they're required to follow, the policies that they have. And then what they can or cannot do reasonably, okay? Certainly, though, if these clients, patients feel like they are being treated less favorably because they are pregnant, that is discrimination. I'm going to say it right there. They should report it to Human Resources saying, I'm being given the more physically onerous position or jobs or tasks, and I think I'm being singled out because I'm pregnant. They keep asking me to do these things, and I keep telling them I cannot because I am pregnant. Now, unfortunately, not every employer has an HR person or an HR department. And that's very tricky because then the supervisor is wearing a lot of hats, and one of those hats is HR. I will sit here and I will tell you right now, as the attorney for a lot of employers, supervisors do not understand the significance of their roles. Okay? I have advocated a lot to say we need to do proactive training to our supervisors. We need to educate them on what the law requires and what we as supervisors, because they are the intermediary oftentimes, can do, should do, cannot do. Threatening a job because you're pregnant, 100% discrimination, and it's illegal. Okay? In cases, the one that stuck out, all of your examples stuck out to me. Let me be clear here. The example of the mom who had a premature child who was in the NICU, and she came back after 2 weeks. That's a difficult one, because from an employer side of things, they should not be returning an individual to work who has not been released to return to work. On the employee side of things, I get why she wanted to do that, so she would have 10 more weeks after the baby was discharged. Because when you are using FMLA for the birth placement or adoption of a child, it typically needs to be 12 consecutive weeks within that first year. Typically, employers can allow the employee to break up those weeks, but that's employer discretion. Okay, I know there's a lot of intricacies in this. In addition to that, the sad part is the employer only has to give 12 weeks legally. If in that scenario the employer chose to give more, that would have really benefited the mom in that situation, but not legally required, unfortunately.
I'm holding the microphone, so I'm going to go next, you guys. Mine's real quick. The PUMP Act, Carta, did you say it started last year? Okay, and then does that apply to all companies or just the ones with more employees? Can you give us a little more information on which that would apply to?
Carta's going to answer specifically as to the PUMP Act, but under the Fair Labor Standards Act, the requirements for lactation breaks actually was enacted several years before that, and that applied to employers with, I can't remember if it was 20 or 25 or more employees, but I'll tell you honestly, I push that policy on all of my clients because I think that that's what they should be providing to their employees.
Okay,
So the answer is the Pump Act applies to employers with 50 or more employees. As Rachel mentioned, there's something called the undue hardship component. So if there are less than 50 employees, the employer may still offer that accommodation or that space for pumping. They're not required to. And specifically, if they can show an undue hardship, i.e., we just can't do it, we don't have the space, they're not required to. However, I was doing some review of this for preparing for today, and under the Pregnancy Workers Fairness Act that Rachel discussed, there is enough overlap that perhaps, and I'll let Rachel, speak to this a little bit more, that they may be able to receive that benefit under that law as opposed to the Pump Act.
Because isn't lactation a childbirth-related condition? That's all I'm going to say about that.
I think we have more questions over there.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
In regards to the pumping space that's required, is there a rule of how close it has to be to the person's workspace? No.
Rachel keeps breaking the rules. Not that I have seen. Again, it's early enough, and that's where Rachel kind of touched on. A lot of times when there are disputes as to these issues, we don't know how the courts will interpret these laws and how they will apply. But I have not seen anything in my review of the law that discusses that. It discusses functionality, but it does not discuss how close in proximity to the workspace it has to be.
So if it's across campus in our situation and it was unpaid, you would have to take the time to go to the place, unpaid, pump, unpaid, and come back.
That's, I'm gonna let
What I will say is, based on how the law is written, yes.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that the employer won't allow for additional time, that they won't agree to pay for time. Because I get caught between, me personally, because I've lived this again, and now I'm on the legal side of things, typically on the employer side. Most of the time, the employer will own, I won't say most of the time, but many times, the employer only gives the bare minimum.
Right. It's the floor, not the ceiling, though.
Correct.
This is a different situation, but do you have any information if high schools are required to make any accommodations for pregnancy?
We have not seen that. I don't think that's addressed in the law, is it?
I know, the microphone, sorry. Most of what we deal with is in the employment context. Now, all of those laws would apply to teachers as employees of the schools, but from a student context, education context. There we go.
So any school who receives federal funding has to abide by Title IX, which is pregnancy is covered in that. Now, it's pregnancy, not childbirth necessarily, but Title IX protects the pregnancy portion where schools have to make accommodations.
Okay. So if a husband and wife, or whatever, who are having a child, are at the same employer, do they have to share the 12 weeks of FMLA, which I've been told?
That is actually true. It's written into the FMLA. So, and the way that they say that is that now, one of the spouses can choose not to take leave at all, but that 12 weeks is shared.
That's another fine print thing.
We have another question. These are great questions and great answers. Thank you all for digging deep.
Now, my question is referring to the law. Applies also to immigration status, somebody that is illegal?
So that's actually combined and overlaps with Title IX or Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act identifies a list of protected categories, and one of them is, I would consider that national origin. There's also a separate law that says we cannot discriminate or retaliate against somebody based on citizenship status. Now, all of these laws, FMLA, et cetera, they apply to employees regardless of any of those protected classes.
Okay, I think there's one last piece we wanted to discuss, and I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Angela Stanley, our Vulnerable Populations Program Officer at the Foundation, to talk a little bit about how do you advocate, particularly all of you who are in the field as case managers, you're working with them. So Angela?
So I don't know about the rest of you, but I've learned so much today, and I'm really grateful that I was, able to hear these two different perspectives. But sometimes it's nice to hear how you can put these things into practice and how people can advocate for themselves, because this is a lot of heavy stuff. And sometimes you feel like if you're the little guy, you may not be able to do anything when you're trying to have these conversations with an employer. So I wanted to just invite some people to give some examples of advocacy and how they have advocated for their clients or themselves, so that they can have the best care and to still have their jobs and to still feel empowered, and to just to make sure that they are protecting themselves and still also keep their employment. So, Dr. Overton?
Okay, so I have the one example that I talked about when we were in our meeting was I had a patient who was employed at a local factory that required some heavy lifting. And she had some preterm labor issues, and I took her off the line. And I said she needs a sit-down job. She can still take her job, do her job, but she needs a sit-down job. Well, they were going to fire her because she could not perform, and this is a few years ago, so it's probably before some of these laws were enacted, because she could not do the job in which she was hired to do, okay? And I get that. As an employer, I understand that. But I also understand that the person who owned this factory was a big-time advocate of pro-life. This woman who was working carried the family's insurance, and there were 2 other children, and her husband was on her insurance. If he fired her, she would lose her insurance. Not only lose her wages, but lose her insurance, right? That meant that the other 2 children would lose their insurance, her husband would lose his insurance, and she would be stuck with a huge hospital bill, unable to work. And I also get that it was probably a supervisor telling her this. So I just sort of talked to the owner and said, I understand that you advocate for pro-life, right? How can you advocate for pro-life and you're causing this woman to make a choice between her baby and her job? And I said, maybe I ought to talk about that more around the community, how you advocate for pro-life, and yet you're making this woman choose to either abort her baby or lose her job. Well, she got her job back. And it was a sit-down job until the end of pregnancy, right? And it could be that he just didn't know that that's what was happening. Because as employers, we make policies and procedures and don't allow other people to enforce those policies and procedures, not understanding that there can be exceptions. Now, if everybody on the line wanted off, I can get where you'd be upset because you can't make a living that way, speaking for the employer. But just one person in that line and there's 60 people, we can work something out. So sometimes it just takes talking to people, and just talking to them. Maybe you just didn't get it. She kept her job, worked for that place from then on after she had her baby, okay?
Maybe talking to people and a little dose of shame. Jackie Martinez also had some stories to share.
I had a couple of stories that were more like medical intervention, but I actually thought of one in my head from when I was doing home visitation, which I had a client, and it was a Spanish-speaking client, and this client worked at one of our local Mexican restaurants. And she, and typically a lot of my Latino clients tend to breastfeed, and they tend to breastfeed for a long time. And we could all say that's really great, but most of them aren't eligible for WIC, depending on immigration. So the help for formula is expensive, but also I think because they naturally, that's their culture and what they grew up. So it was really important for her to do this, right? But she also really needed her job. And her job at this restaurant had one bathroom. And I don't know if you guys ever been or worked at a restaurant setting. I did, and I remember, like, you tracked grease everywhere, and there was one bathroom, and everybody shared it. The cooks, the waitresses, like everyone, and it's not sanitary, really. And so she was faced with this. There was nowhere to pump. She needed a pump, but she needed to work, and there was no space being provided, and that wasn't a top priority for those managers. So her and I brainstormed what are other options that are less costly and still accommodating that we can approach your supervisor with. And I actually went with her to this local, and we kind of brainstormed, and I think it goes back to what Dr. Overton was saying. The supervisor was enlightened, and I think appreciated that she had someone to advocate for her. We explained the situation and the circumstance, and of course, she's an outstanding employee that he didn't want to lose. And so subsequently, low cost, you guys know those little privacy, like 3/4, like, I don't know what they're called, partition little things that you can stick. Everybody in, and including the restaurant, shipped in, and they made this makeshift corner for her to be able to pump when needed, and subsequently others, it stayed there and it became their pumping space. Everybody knew when it was happening, there was a sign, there was a chair, and a little privacy, and that was enough to accommodate her for the space that was necessary, low cost, and it, you know, she was able to continue to work, and she was able to continue to pump. And of course, there's fridges there because, you know, so there was a little space for it. But something as little as me going in with her to encourage her, to empower her, and to also educate this manager really led to her keeping her job, being able to pump and store her milk for her baby. Right, and then other people, it was like a rippling effect. So that's the story. Did you have a story to share, Maria?
Well, kind of. So, yeah, we missed the memo on the right topics, the story, so I came with a different story. But I can still think of a good example for this client, kind of around making accommodations. She was a beloved client, a high school student getting ready to graduate. And actually, she ended up with preeclampsia, which is why I had originally chosen her, because really, I was thinking, advocating for her, how important that was. She called the doctor, was admitted, and delivered shortly after. And because of intervention, she and baby are doing really well. So that was exciting. But during that pregnancy, we worked closely together, and a goal of hers was to graduate high school. She was so close. It was her senior year. And you know how challenging it can be sometimes for teenagers to speak up for themselves. And I think the two of us working together really empowered her to work with her teachers. There were times where she needed more time on assignments because of appointments and different things, and she was able to graduate, and that was super exciting. So I think the advocacy part for me is what's so important in what we do. It might feel small because it's just one person, but that person has a voice, and now that person's voice, it ripples because they share it with others. So that's my little non-medical story.
Does anybody have any other examples of advocacy that you'd like to share, just to inspire or encourage? I don't want to take the opportunity from anyone. Thank you so much for sharing those. I think sometimes it's really nice to get ideas of how to put theoretical things into practice.
We're about to, as we wrap up, we have surveys on there. Any ideas of topics that you would like us to be addressing? We want you, and if you think there's a specific speaker, please let us know. We really want to hear from you. Any other thoughts on that survey? I would be remiss if I did not recognize, because they were too humble to introduce themselves, but standing in the back of the room is my wonderful colleagues from the St. Joe Foundation who did all the heavy lifting for this today. So Angela Stanley, you guys have heard, is really putting together a lot of the work for these luncheons, so thank you, Angela. And we have Marla Rust at the end, who helps us coordinate, our office coordinator, Mary Tyndall, who we pull off of food and PR occasionally to help us on these things, and behind the camera, Mark Burkholder. And so thanks to all of them. But thank you all. Any feedback, we very much welcome. Thank you.